My eyes are... You've never used them before.
At a foundational level, what is my philosophy, and why does it lead to this conclusion? When I was a teenager, I had like an existential crisis to try to figure out what's the meaning of life. It doesn't seem to be any meaning. For me, at least, the religious texts, and I read all of them that I get my hands on, did not seem convincing. Then I started reading philosophers. Be careful of like reading German philosophers as a teenager. It's definitely not going to help with your depression. So reading Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, like. So then I was like, man, I'm just like struggling to find meaning in life here, and then I read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Earth, it turns out, is a big computer. And its goal is to answer the question, what's the meaning of life? And Earth comes up with the answer 42. This is where the 42 number comes from. In that book, which is really sort of a book about, it's an existential philosophy book disguised as humor. They come to the conclusion that no, the real problem is trying to formulate the question. So, and to really have the right question, you need a much bigger computer than Earth. The universe is the answer. What is the question? The more we can expand the scope and scale of consciousness, the better we can understand what questions to ask about the answer that is the universe. The more we can expand consciousness, become a multi-planet species, ultimately a multicellular species, we have a chance of figuring out what the hell's going on. And this is why I think we should have more humans and more digital, both biological and digital consciousness, and why we should become a multi-planet species and a multicellular species, is so that we can understand the nature of the universe.
And what I want to discuss today is one particularly important the possibilities that we are now facing, which is the rise of artificial intelligence and the potential that artificial intelligence will become the dominant life form on Earth and even beyond the Earth. And what would that mean for Homo sapiens? Because what's happening now is maybe not just the most important revolution in human history, but the most important revolution in biology since the beginning of life, at least on Earth. All life forms for 4 billion years evolved by natural selection, and all life forms were restricted to the organic realm. This is now changing. We are on the verge not only of replacing natural selection with intelligent design, not the intelligent design of some god, our intelligent design, as the principal motor of the evolution of life. We are also on the verge of allowing life to break out for the first time from the organic realm into the inorganic and creating the first inorganic life forms after 4 billion years of evolution, which also implies that life will for the first time have a serious chance of breaking out of planet Earth and beginning to spread in the rest of the galaxy, in the rest of the universe. Organic life have been adapted to the very unique conditions of this planet for 4 billion years. So despite what you see on Star Trek, which is just now celebrating 50 years, it's extremely difficult to sustain organic life in outer space or on other planets, which is why it's very unlikely that organic life will be able to spread and to flourish outside Earth. Once you switch from organic to inorganic, it becomes much easier. So we are really on the verge of these two intertwined revolutions, moving from the organic to the inorganic and moving from planet Earth actually to the rest of the universe, to the rest of the galaxy.
A Obviously, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, written together with Arthur C. Clarke in 1968, is a story of human evolution. But there is a curious added element, because in this vision, it's not just the advancement of humanity through Darwin's natural selection, but the evolution of the cosmos as well, with an unseen intelligence that intervenes to assist its progress. Kubrick and Clarke's vision involves proactively engaging with the cosmos in a purposeful and almost obligatory way, like missionaries of an unseen cosmic religion with the capability to turn planets into suns. It is a religion, and that religion is scientific cosmism. Cosmism is a philosophical and cultural movement founded in the early 20th century by Nikolai Fyodorovich Fedorov. Considered by his devotees the Socrates of Moscow, it is said that Fyodorov's philosophical formulation was cultivated through an Orthodox Christian perspective, which is odd because he seems to have completely abandoned it in favor of other schools of thought percolating among the intellectuals of that time. So what exactly did Fedorov propose? Taking from a verse in the Gospel of Matthew, he builds the foundation for his thesis. In Matthew 10, Jesus is sending out the 12 disciples to spread the news of his teachings, and he gives them a specific set of instructions. Quote, "As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, and drive out demons." End quote. In his treatise, The Philosophy of the Common Task, published posthumously in 1908, Fedorov proposed a dramatic reorganization of human society that combined science, a few Bible verses, the occult, and utopian socialism that he believed should begin with the resurrection of every human being that ever lived, and more, that man could become immortal through scientific and technological interventions that dictate with scientific accuracy a forced evolutionary change along a specific course. Resurrecting every human being that ever lived was to have at the ready a massive cache of human knowledge that could be used to dictate the course of the future, including the mysteries from beyond. Resurrecting the dead to consult them like an oracle to dictate the future? If you haven't picked up on it yet, the biblical term for this is necromancy and sorcery. But the earth is only so big, it can only house so many. Where will we put everyone? According to Fedorov, once the problem of death has been solved and lifespans are indefinitely extended, space travel now becomes possible. To Fedorov, it was our duty to colonize other planets and populate the universe, to spread human consciousness throughout the cosmos, with a select population of the genetic best among us to rule over it all. However, Fedorov failed to acknowledge some very important elements of the verses in Matthew 10. Known as the First Commission, Jesus sends out the 12 disciples 2 by 2, with specific instructions and a special set of supernatural abilities that were given for their mission at hand. Jesus calls the 12, then Matthew lists them by name. The chapter makes this very clear. There are no other names on this list, and it's not left open-ended. He gives them the authority to heal the sick and drive out demons. These abilities were not given to every believer in Christ. They were given to the 12. These miracles were not bestowed upon any person in need that they may encounter along the way. They were reserved specifically for the lost sheep of Israel, and for the express purpose of establishing the identity of Jesus as the promised Messiah as written by the prophets that came before him. And it bears mentioning that the phrase, "raise the dead," is missing from many early manuscripts. There are no accounts of the apostles raising the dead before Christ's ascension. It's a rare occurrence even in Jesus' case. There are 2 cases of apostles raising the dead in the book of Acts, but strong scholarship lends to the likelihood that these individuals were more than likely saved from dying rather than brought back from the dead. The gifts of the First Commission were isolated to the office of the apostles in the early formation of the church during Jesus' earthly ministry. While the apostolic gifts are no longer needed to verify the authenticity and authority of Christ and his church, this in no way limits God's ability to work miracles through any vessel he chooses. The Great Commission, found in Matthew 28, which is the final commission given to the apostles just prior to Jesus' ascension, states, quote, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age.'" End quote. After Jesus' ascension, the final commission is to make disciples of all nations, baptize them, and teach them Jesus' commands. Resurrecting the dead is not on this list, the door on that is closed because the work of the cross is complete. The idea that resurrecting the dead is an open-ended spiritual gift given to all believers until the end of time is a blasphemous notion that negates the work of the cross and renders Jesus' return and his salvation for us meaningless. It certainly wasn't given to apostates and unbelievers to usurp the divine authority of the entire cosmos. The spiritual gifts given to establish the church as delineated by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 include apostleship, prophecy, teaching, guidance and wisdom, discernment, speaking in other languages, interpreting those other languages, helping, and miraculous powers, with love being the most important and greatest gift among them all. The term miraculous powers in Greek has nothing to do with resurrecting the dead or any other miscellaneous category of miracles. Energema, from where we get the word energy, and dunamis, from where we get the words dynamic, dynamo, and dynamite, represent the power of God in action. It's a force, an energy at work through God's chosen vessel. Raising the dead, which is a very specific spiritual ability, is not included anywhere in this list. There's a good book on this subject titled Our Miraculous Gifts for Today, 4 Views. It gives an extensive analysis of the 4 views on spiritual gifts, of which I lean toward the cessationist view. It's difficult to fathom that anyone took Fedorov's idea of universal scientific resurrection seriously, but it was wholeheartedly accepted by some of the most profound radicals in history, like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and an entire generation of Marxists ahead of the Russian Revolution. Some of Fedorov's disciples include utopian revolutionaries like Alexander Bogdanov, who founded the Bolsheviks with Lenin in 1917, and Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was an esotericist, an astrophysicist, a rocket scientist, and the founder of the Russian space program. Fedorov's idea was not exactly an original concept. The notion of necromancy and immortality for the revolution was already a topic of discussion and literary discourse among the intelligentsia. There was this tension going on among the anti-religious socialist utopians, in particular among the romanticists who were revolted by the cold mechanistic materialism that the rationalists tended to foment. Darwin had already equated humans with animals who faced the same threat of extinction, and most had now abandoned God in favor of all this new science. Science became the instrument that was supposed to solve the very problem that science had claimed to reveal: mortality. Darwin and his atheist contemporaries were like, after death, it's just to the worms. And everyone believed them. And then after realizing what this really means, recoiled in horror at the idea. Did they run to God seeking salvation for their souls? No, of course not. The Romanticists became hyper-infatuated with the occult system and the secret orders, particularly of the Rosy Cross. For example, Dostoevsky, considered one of the greatest psychologists to ever set pen to paper, and known for many literary works such as Crime and Punishment and The Possessed, also known as The Demons, was an admirer of Fedorov and shared his ideas of creating a scientifico-magical utopian system. His literary works make evident the struggle between biblical morality and the quote-unquote exceptional man, this prototype Übermensch, who's willing to discard established morals and norms so the revolution could take place, even if that meant doing terrible things to a lot of people. He writes The Possessed, which gives strong literary critique through a fictional character study of the nihilistic materialism that was running rampant in thinking circles. Dostoevsky equated a nihilist worldview with being possessed by demons, and I'm not sure he's wrong. Ironically, big fat nihilist Friedrich Nietzsche said Dostoevsky was, quote, the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn, end quote.
Nietzsche's universe is chaotic, and his shadow looms over all of culture, particularly the West, but since the West is to a great extent globalized, he is, in some ways, the maker of the 20th century and, to a great extent, the 21st. He is going to give us something like the theory of the exceptional man that was so characteristic of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He's going to argue that morality is the interests of the majority, what he calls the herd, those who are superior, not exceptional men in Raskolnikov's language, but those who are Übermenschen, those who are above human, those human beings who dare to make and break morality, are the ones that he is most impressed with. He wrote a book called The Antichrist, and that was him. He decided that Christianity was over and that we were going to need someone to take Jesus's place, and he decided he would do that. He thinks that Christianity, with its omnipotent, omniscient God, reinforced the Greek idea of, Platonic idea of absolute truth with a capital T. Nietzsche thinks that this belief in truth creates natural science. And over the centuries, in the development of natural science, we had a scientific revolution in the West, and it was unique to the West, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. This scientific revolution, this new understanding of the physical universe, reaches its high point in Newton and Newtonian mechanics. And the last great burst of this was roughly contemporary with Nietzsche, and that would be Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution by itself was an enormous intellectual earthquake, because what it did was show that human beings are perfectly continuous with nature, and that rather than being a separate creation created in God's image, in fact, we're complicated apes. We're not made in any particular image. We are the random result of a random blind process. Now, what many of the people of the educated classes in Western Europe in the second half of the 19th century thought was that this is no big deal. We'll be able to skate along, as we always have, with a rather ironic detachment from religious tradition. Nietzsche is far more intelligent and far more penetrating than that. He says, "You fools, you don't understand what you've done. Once you have eliminated God, if there's no God's eye synoptic view of the world, then there's no universal truth. There's just your perspective and my perspective and everybody else's perspective. You have such shallow souls. If you had any sense at all, you would realize that this is a momentous catastrophe, that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Nietzsche, unlike the other intellectuals in the late 19th century, sees the implications of the collapse of religion. The world is in all eternity chaos. Chaos in the Greek tradition is compared or refers to cosmos as the alternative. A cosmos is an ordered universe. Chaos is a disordered universe. Cosmos is knowable. Chaos is not. Once we've killed God, we've also destroyed knowledge, which means science is dead, philosophy is dead, our whole intellectual tradition has suffered an earthquake-like disaster. And Nietzsche says, what do we do now? Nietzsche says the madman is the one who announces that God is dead. And he goes to the churches and he sees that people are going through the motions but don't believe this anymore. The madman says, don't you realize how catastrophic this is? That everything is now tumbling down around our heads. He describes it as falling in every direction at once. Imagine being in interstellar space. No up, no down, no front, no back. Where are we? What are we? All of this is up for grabs now. Since the Christian God is now dead, he's not kidding when he thinks, I can replace that. Because if Christianity was a human construction, well then its destruction was equally human. And if we need something to fill in the gap, Nietzsche's willing to step up and give us his best shot. He thinks Christianity is dead, so he's actually trying to offer us some way out of this labyrinth. I have a new religion for you. I'm going to revive the religion of Dionysus. Dionysus versus the crucified, because the status that rationality previously held, it can no longer hold. Hegel said that the realm of absolute spirit, the highest achievements of human beings, are three things, because there's three of everything in Hegel: art, religion, and philosophy. Well, Nietzsche believes that he has shown quite conclusively, regardless of whether people believe him or not, that religion and philosophy are gone, they're dead, and that leaves only art. So Nietzsche is going to create a philosophy of culture which says art is the only way out of the labyrinth. We must construct life-giving illusions.
Fedorov's philosophy removes the perception of resurrection being an act of God's grace, something within God's power alone, and places the ability and the obligation squarely in the hands of certain men. It attempts to abolish both the apocalypse and judgment. If what Fedorov and his contemporaries called for were achieved, there would be no reason for Christ's birth, much less his return. Man could fashion his own salvation and immortality and create his own eternal kingdom of heaven. It was around this time that the very influential, very well-funded Society for Psychical Research emerged. The society was run and supported for many years by a long list of disturbing characters, including esotericist and mystic Henry Sedgwick, Arthur Balfour, former British Prime Minister known for channeling spirits of the dead through automatic writing, Alfred Russel Wallace, co-theorist of natural selection with Darwin, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were members, and William James, one of the first behavioral psychologists and contemporary of Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt was the man who wanted to use the animal training method, also known as operant conditioning, on humans. He wanted to bypass the brain and use the central nervous system to program people to think and behave a certain way. William James, unwilling to accept the limitations being presented by the Darwinians, believed that there exists a realm in which the thoughts and memories of humans are stored and preserved and could be accessed by a collective of psychics working in unison. The society focused on finding scientific evidence that human consciousness, the human personality, survived after death. And through their many seances and other efforts to cultivate paranormal superpowers, they were going to find it. Dabbling with the occult and necromancy eventually led to the society becoming involved in a secret scheme to conceive a messianic child, which didn't become public until almost a century later. They considered the Institute's experiments cutting-edge science. The cosmos' quest for immortality was indistinguishable from Russian revolutionary thought and the rise of the Soviet Union. Cosmism promoted the ideas that were central to communist goals, namely to conquer nature and create a race of immortal super beings that will rule the universe. The Marxist notion of quote-unquote God-building was a strategy of the early Bolsheviks who believed that communism and the accompanying advance of science would ultimately bestow physical immortality upon its leaders, turning mortals into gods. Among the Bolshevik god-builders was Fedorov disciple Alexander Bogdanov, part of a rival faction of Lenin that included Theosophists Maxim Gorky and Anatoly Lunacharsky, who shared Fedorov's opinion that the cold mechanistic materialism of Marx and Lenin brought with it the despair of nihilism. Nihilism is what drove men mad, rendering them useless. They yearned for a stronger quote-unquote spiritual force, spiritual as in morale and motivation, not metaphysics, that would reframe hearts and minds for the globalist communist worldview of a new nature and a new world. Bogdanov, considered a sort of Marxist Benjamin Franklin, in addition to being a founder of the Bolshevik Party, was a leading proponent of both Russian cosmism and its related science fiction. Instead of the abolition of religion, which fervent atheist Vladimir Lenin was in a blind fury to force upon the world en masse, Bogdanov wanted to craft a meta-religion, one that accommodates the cosmist communist worldview and is perfectly compatible with science. Their designated leaders would become the divine instruments of global communism. Lenin and his faction wanted everyone to just shut up and accept their alienation, that there is no God. Man is born a blank slate, like a blank sheet of paper, for which society and history wrote upon him his worth and purpose. Men were not made in the image of God. Everyday people were merely a material commodity, cogs in the machine. In an article from the New York Times titled "Make It So, Star Trek and Its Debt to Revolutionary Socialism," quote, Alexander Bogdanov, an early political rival of Lenin's, wrote Red Star, a utopian novel about a communist colony on Mars, where everything was held in common and lifespans were greatly extended through the use of parabiosis, the mutual sharing of blood. Bogdanov proposed a program of God-building, which would replace the rituals and myths of the Orthodox Church through creation of an atheistic religion. These bio-Cosmist-Immortalists, as they were known, believed that socialist scientists, freed from the constraints of the capitalist profit motive, would discover how to abolish death and bring back their comrades. Lenin's corpse remains preserved for the occasion, end quote. If Cosmist-Immortalism had its own visual Bible, there is no better specimen than Kubrick's Space Odyssey. I have a hunch that Kubrick presents his Odyssey to the world as a work of anarchy, a nose-thumbing to the church, the establishment, the military-industrial complex, and all the sleeping masses under their spell. I'm sure his patience often wore thin with the worldview that he had, and having to work with the very people he despised, being that he had an IQ of 200, and everyone around him probably seemed as dull dull as the chimpanzees in the opening scene of his film. Many of the concepts that Clarke wrote about in his science fiction books that he was attributed credit, like geostationary communication satellites, orbiting space stations, the space elevator, rockets to the moon, and even an early concept of the space shuttle, were not original thoughts that came from Clarke's brain. He was just the pamphleteer who put it all in story form. Constantine already theorized and published works on all this stuff, including rocket propulsion, space exploration, and orbiting human habitats, decades before Clarke began clacking away at his Remington Deluxe. Tsiolkovsky and Fabian socialists such as H.G. Wells, T.H. Huxley and Sons, and Isaac Asimov with his notion of vanguard leadership of the Galactic Empire from his Foundation series, which incidentally mirrored Lenin's idea of a vanguard party that would drive the masses forward to revolutionary consciousness. These men and other technocratic workers of the craft believed that there should be a single political system for the entire universe that should be governed by the most advanced specimens of humanity. Less intelligent and less hardy life forms should simply be eliminated. Tsiolkovsky wrote, quote, "In 1,000 million years, nothing imperfect, such as contemporary fauna, flora, and human beings, will be existing on Earth. Only the best will remain. In the cosmos, there is no place for imperfect, suffering life. Intelligent and advanced planets annihilate such life forms." End quote. H.G. Wells certainly echoed this idea. In an article from 2011 in The New Yorker, quote, "Wells may not have been an expert in any particular scientific field, but he believed wholeheartedly in the idea of science, especially when it came to the rational government of human beings. In book after book, novels and nonfiction alike, Wells hammered home the message that humanity could improve its lot only by entrusting power to a self-selected caste of enlightened technicians who would rule according to the dictates of science. At different times, he called this virtuous elite the New Republicans, the Samurai, and the Open Conspiracy. It can be thought of as an idealized version of the Fabian Society, the elite socialist group to which Wells briefly belonged. He first described this caste in Anticipations, the 1901 book he called the keystone to the main arch of my work. The dominant men of the new time, he writes, will all be artists in reality, with a passion for simplicity and directness, and an impatience of confusion and inefficiency, dedicated to creating the future world state to which all things are pointing, end quote. Incidentally, certain other groups will also be excluded from his elite caste, a quote conveniently left out of the article in The New Yorker. Quote, Wells was also, like many progressives of his time, a believer in eugenics, and he could write with disconcerting eagerness about which categories of human beings would be put to death in his utopian state. The New Republic, he wrote in Anticipations, would have no use for a multitude of contemptible and silly creatures, fear-driven and helpless and useless, unhappy or hatefully happy in the midst of squalid dishonor, feeble, ugly, inefficient, born of unrestrained lusts, and increasing and multiplying through sheer incontinence and stupidity. In the shining future, Wells wrote, the elite would feel good about killing off such people because they will have an ideal that will make killing worth the while, end quote. Wells was a member of the League of Nations and also helped to draft a manifesto that became the basis for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Goal-directed evolution figures prominently in many science fiction novels about the transmutation to Homo superior, including Olaf Stapleton's Star Maker in 1937 and Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End in 1953. In Childhood's End, Clarke depicts an invasion of cloven-hoofed demon overlords who assume control of the Earth while communicating solely with their chosen ambassador, the Secretary General of the United Nations. They study humans like lab rats for quote-unquote psychical research, in search of humans with psychic ability, while simultaneously cultivating a hive mind of an entire generation of innocent Earth children. They provide a galactic Ouija board to consult the overmind like an oracle. The overmind is a vast cosmic collective superintelligence of disembodied, highly evolved humans that reside somewhere out among the cosmos. Of course, the presence of the demon overlords brings a utopian golden age, as long as nobody has a single independent creative thought ever, and only to be later nuked into oblivion right after all the Earth children are transported off planet. The demon overlords in Clarke's vision facilitate those humans who have reached the apex of their evolution, are now disembodied, and have become part of the cosmic collective intelligence he calls the overmind.
Everything that has happened on Earth was planned long ago. It's natural. It's the cosmos. It's the overmind.
Or as Crowley put it, they no longer exist quote-unquote below in the material universe, but now reside above in this Luciferian Gnostic heaven realm called the Zero, the void that exists outside of space and time and is comprised of pure mind consciousness. The Space Odyssey book series ends when Bowman, who's the space baby returned to Earth to nuke it out of the sky, and then later merges with machine intelligence, with Hal, then evolves beyond that to pure consciousness. Physical body nor monolith machine container no longer necessary.
All Dave Bowman really was is still a part of me.
Clarke's mysterious alien intelligence is highly evolved man, who became the monolith. Clarke also talked about how man will one day become the spaceships themselves, which is why perhaps Kubrick might have made the various craft in his film with faces. The monolith full of men expands itself throughout the cosmos, providing teaching tools to either help propel civilizations forward or nuke the non-compliant into oblivion. Clarke loves the nuked Earth ending a lot. And in case you still had doubts this was a satanic Gnostic cosmology,
my God, it's full of stars.
The Book of the Law is claimed by Aleister Crowley to be a channeled work by a demonically inspired superhuman intelligence that he calls Aiwaz, the entity around which he fashioned his satanic Gnostic cult thelema. Aiwaz makes predictions of wars and revolutions that will lead to the collapse of Christian civilization. No surprise there. Aiwaz has been described as an external being, a high ascended master, as Blavatsky put it, or a secret chief, as the Maguses of the Golden Dawn put it. He has been attributed to Crowley's holy guardian angel that exists in the Gnostic void, the Zero. Ultimately, Crowley referred to Aiwaz as his dark inner self. The first 3 chapters of the Book of the Law are spoken by the members of Crowley's unholy trinity. Nut, based very loosely on the ancient Egyptian goddess, who in the book describes herself as quote-unquote infinite space and the infinite stars thereof. Nut is symbolized as the night sky arched over the winged disk and figures below, and described as a sphere whose circumference is nowhere and whose center is everywhere. Hadit, her male counterpart, who dictates the second chapter of the book, is the infinitely small point at the center of the sphere. According to the teachings of Thelema, it is the interaction between these 2 cosmic principles, or opposites, that creates the manifested universe, similar to the Gnostic syzygy. The book teaches the apprentice magician that the great work is to discover and do the will of one's own true self. Crowley explains, quote, every man and every woman is a star moving in their own orbit, by their own unique nature, not to be diverted into a common mold of uniformity. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Thou hast no right but to do thy will, and there is no law beyond do what thou wilt. Each star, everything, follows its own nature, its own will, end quote. Crowley writes, quote, do what thou wilt is to bid stars to shine, vines to bear grapes, water to seek its level, end quote. In other words, to be a star in Crowley's demented system of degradation means that through your own will, you have completed the evolutionary and alchemical process of becoming your own god.
My God, it's full of stars.
Helena Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence speaks of the 7 portals. In Blavatsky's Theosophy, which was a parallel Antichrist cosmology to Crowley's thelema, she explains the 2 paths one must take to achieve enlightened status. The first path is liberation. The second is renunciation. Remember, Blavatsky's main mission was to craft a satanic-inspired humanistic meta-religion that replaced and then destroyed Christianity. Once the eager Theosophical disciple understands the 2 paths, he will pass through 7 stages of transmutation called quote-unquote portals. These 7 portals each have a gatekeeper. These gatekeepers are the 7 primordial beings, the Ahi or Logoi, that emanated from the first logos in Blavatsky's version of this Luciferian Gnostic cosmology. Each one of these rays or gatekeepers can be identified with one of the 7 prismatic colors. Once one has reached the end of the path, the mind is clear. One is disentangled from delusive thoughts. Quote, "Sweet are the fruits of rest and liberation for the sake of self. Sweeter the fruits of long and bitter duty. Aye, renunciation for the sake of others, of suffering fellow men." End quote. In other words, once you've done the quote-unquote great work of completely stripping yourself of every last shred of Christian identity through renunciation and liberation, just as the serpent claimed in the garden, you've reached godhood, your own divinity. You've crossed the rainbow bridge, or what Crowley referred to as the abyss, reached the apex of your enlightenment, and now shine like a brilliant star. You are the Bodhisattva, and through your example become a savior of the world. Saving the world from what exactly? Well, we know what. The Stargate is divided into 2 sections. In the first portion, as Bowman crosses the Rainbow Bridge, you will notice that he endures several painful and terrifying stages, each marked by an almost instant shot of Bowman's face. When he completes the 6th stage and enters the 7th, he levels up to an all-seeing eye. This is expressed in the ecstasy of the starburst. The Rainbow Bridge has taken him back through time and space to the beginning, the moment of conception of the material universe. Remember, for these people, the cosmos is a conscious living entity that was quote-unquote born into existence. The Rainbow Bridge has taken him to the very first cosmic thought, penetrating like a seed the embryonic primordial cosmos, of which the completion of this stage is marked by the all-seeing eye that persists, taking him to the next stage of his cosmic evolution. The midway point, Grand Central. It's here that he encounters the gatekeepers, the 7 primordial rays, presented as platonic forms, octahedrons, double pyramids. The gatekeepers direct him forward. He continues on the path, acknowledged by the eye, to the next phase. The Rainbow Bridge has been crossed, and it looks as if he's landed inverted on a planet, sky above like a mirror, reflecting what's below, colors reversed in negative values. It's here that you see his all-seeing eye, still on the path, still evolving, transition through 6 color changes. Before graduating to his clear human eye on the 7th, signifying his advent to the final stage of his transmutation. The trauma of the journey across the Rainbow Bridge, the seemingly eternal abyss, is evident here. It's not an easy ride. Of course, stripping yourself of God and everything you know to be true would certainly be a painful and traumatic process. And they tell you this. They already know, and they think it's good. Quote, "Sweet are the fruits of rest and liberation for the sake of self. Sweet are the fruits of long and bitter duty. Aye, renunciation for the sake of others, of suffering fellow men." End quote. In the book Secret Societies, the author explains, quote, "By the time the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, which was made in 1968, reached classic status in the eponymous year 2001, the resulting quote-unquote evolutionary being was revealed to not be a child of Homer, whose sails are powered by a solar wind, but rather a homunculus out of the shadows, from which emerges Set Shaitan Cynocephalus, guardian deity of alchemical miscegenation, an entity beyond the spiral of nature, the maker of an alien wasteland more barren and sterile than any envisioned by T.S. Eliot or Samuel Beckett." The mute monolith of 2001 is the harbinger of what Clarke calls, in another of his works, the overlord. It is the ashlar of the secret societies. The monolith represents the shaping function of the occult magus, who tames and tampers with the natural world. The 2001 monolith is the stake that impales the divine organic in favor of the anthropomorphic artifice. It is one of the totems of human brain power and of the cryptocrats, who image themselves the most cerebral of us all. They believe there is no God but themselves, ascendant on the ladder of evolution." End quote. He continues, "The working in its entirety represents the process of human alchemy, dedicated to the transformation of base matter, humanity, into the gold that is the man-beast within the psychodrama that is the revelation of the method-making manifest of all that is hidden, which was initiated just a few years after John Dee's death in the pages of the 1615 Rosicrucian Manifesto, Confessio Fraternitatis, or Confession of the Laudable Fraternity of the Most Honorable Order of the Rosy Cross." End quote. In his book 2010 Odyssey 2, Clarke depicts a massive fleet of self-replicating monoliths that alchemically transform the planet Jupiter into a new sun, which he calls Lucifer. This newly created light-bearer illumines the Earth's sky, and with it, quote, "a generation would soon be born that had never known a world without Lucifer," end quote. The final portion of the message, comprised of 11 words, heralds to Earth, quote, "all these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landing there," end quote. A new Genesis story begins on Europa, a planet with Lucifer as its life-giving sun.